Now, joining me in the studio to take a look at the proscription of the Islamic Movement of Nigeria, I have Biodun Shomi, a public affairs analyst. It's good to have you join us, Mr. Shomi.
I'm pleased to be here.
Falana says that the proscription of the group is immoral and illegal, and he's saying that it's also because the Sunnis who are in public office are using the powers that they have to somewhat suppress the Shiites. Where do you stand on this?
Yeah, it's quite obvious. You don't need a Falana, you don't need even a lawyer to tell you that, look, there are certain things which are expressly stated in the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, 1999 as amended. When you go through that Constitution, you will quite clearly see the freedom of expression is guaranteed. You have a right to peaceful assembly. You have a right, to associate, with others. And
but if
you
the
also
assembly
have a right
becomes not necessarily peaceful or becomes violent, have you not breached some form of the Constitution? And I'm just playing the devil's advocate.
Look, when you have a protest going on and maybe a John provocateur or some of the protesters, become unruly, the right thing to do is to apprehend those who become unruly, those who are disturbing public peace or those who are damaging vehicles or being violent, and then arraign them in court. It is not to abridge the right of Nigerians to protest. That is to freedom of expression, freedom of speech. Protest is a form of expressing your grievances against what is going on in the country. We should not forget that, look, if, apart from the fact that this is the second one, if we allow this trend to continue, there will be a day that people who protest against one thing or the other, like students, like labor union, will simply be proscribed. And that is dictatorial in nature. It is totally antagonistic, to the interests of democracy and the provisions of the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. We should not forget that proscription has never solved any problem. Quite often, it has always created more problems for government. In the first instance, if you remember, I think it's 1981 or 82, Nance was proscribed by the National Association of Nigerian Students, by the federal government. By 1985, you have the Babangida government, 1986, actually, they proscribing it with a view to negotiate with it, because they could not negotiate with the students while they were under proscription. So they had to recognize Nance at that point in time under the leadership of Emir Ezeazu, in order to negotiate with it. The same thing you have in 2016, the Kaduna State government proscribed IMN. That's the Islamic Movement in Nigeria. Yes. Until today, they continue to operate. You have the same situation in 2017, IPOB. Indigenous people of Biafra, was also proscribed, even though they were peaceful organizations.
Well, there are people who would say that what they were, because, we failed to address the reasons for these protests or the reasons for these people hitting the streets and saying whatever they say. In the case of IPOB, a lot of people will say what they were asking for was treasonous, as opposed to what IMN is asking for, which is justice for a person who has been granted bail by several courts, and within and without, and yet that person is still not given right to fair hearing. So putting them side by side, they're two different issues.
No, when you even look at the IPOB situation, many people don't bother to study the treaties signed by Nigeria as a country. The United Nations Charter is quite very clear on right to self-determination. Why did you sign the UN Charter if you don't want that right guarantee? Why didn't you negotiate an exclusion that we don't want any situation where people have a right to self-determination? So if you have done that, then that's a different case. We signed it. It's the same thing with African People's Charter on People's Rights. We also signed that, which also provides for for right to self-determination. So therefore, for anybody to accuse anybody of trying to break away from the country, is illogical. We have also signed international treaties to say Nigerians have a right to, ethnic nationalities have a right to determine their own fate. So it's quite very obvious. When you look at the other angle, from the government side of it, government keeps saying we are trying to protect public interest. What is public interest? They will end up telling you security. When you say, okay, who will define public interest? It's not the executive that will interpret it. It is the judiciary. For instance, if you look at many of the cases in court, including El-Zakzaky's case, the federal government claims they are holding him on the basis of public interest. Okay, fine. You are trying to protect Nigerians. Okay. But then you've taken him to court. Because the law says you must take him to court. Now, you are supposed to plead that public interest while arguing the motion for bail. And then a judge will weigh it and then interpret public interest and then decide whether in reality the basis of holding him will be justified or not. But what you see is that the government will take people to court, court will give his ruling, government will turn around and say in public interest. That's a generic term. It's vague, it's subject to abuse, it's something that needs to be examined. So, and executive cannot do that. They have a separate function.
This whole thing, does this not in any way make the judiciary look weak and not able to function as it should in a normal country, for example? Because we have three arms of government, the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature. But it looks like with all of this disobedience or waving away court orders, it makes the judiciary seem like it's not strong in a way.
Well, I won't look at it that way. I would look at it in another way, which is, even though the net effect could be the judiciary is weak, but you need to trace the cause of the problem, which is the unitary constitution which we operate in the country today, where everything is centralized. And that is why the whole security forces are under the federal government, even though they have little idea of what goes on in one place or the other. And that is why you see crime, kidnapping, herdsmen killing going on, in different parts of the country, because there is no way how you can manage this localized situation, from the center. So when you actually take the issue of the weak, whether the courts are weak or not, look at it from this angle. There are three arms of government: the executive, legislature, and judiciary. What is the difference in all of them? The difference, they're all separate arms of government, supposedly independent of each other, as guaranteed by our constitution. The difference in all of them is that the federal government controls the security services, the police and army and all that. And therefore, if the federal government thinks this way, the executive thinks this way, they can use the security services to enforce their will. Whereas that is not the intention of the Constitution or the writers of the Constitution. And that is not how it's supposed to operate. So because of that, we find the executive now dabbling, into what concerns executive, the legislature and also the judiciary.
Okay. Moving on, we saw senators and House of Rep members on the floor speaking on this issue. A few of them, they were divided. A few of them were for a dialogue. Some of them advocated that, government has a dialogue of sorts with the IMN instead of prescribing, and others were outrightly asking for prescription. But do you not think that this overnight prescription of IMN is hasty, and it could have some form of a terrible after effect?
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite hasty. If you go by our record in our country, the last time I remembered such a quick prescription after a major protest was under the military. So it's quite very hasty to start with, even though it's not a solution to the problem. Rather, we are only compounding the problem because you now drive them underground. The complication in all this is the international dimension to it. You have, on the national front, you have more or less a religious war going on, between the Sunnis, war in court, between the Sunni and the Shiites, the battle for supremacy over Islamic religion. Now, the Constitution guarantees freedom of religion for everybody. You have a right to worship freely, depending on whichever religion you want. But what you see is that we currently have a Sunni leadership in the country, and the Sunni leadership sees an opportunity to finally deal with the Shiites. Don't forget, a lot of funding going into Sukuk currently being used for major projects in the country, comes from Saudi Arabia. They are the ones funding it one way or the other. So when you find that situation, the Nigerian government is willing to please the Saudis because it's also a Sunni-led country. Now, we find ourselves in a situation where some 3 years ago, 3 years ago, I think it's precisely 2016, you know, when the Saudis called for coalition of the willing, Nigeria decided to join the coalition of willing, you know, in the affairs of Syria, in the Syrian war. What is our business with Syria? Where is our national interest? Because Syria aligns, you know, with the Iranians, who are largely Shiite. So, and then we chose to do that. So we brought ourselves into the notice, you know, of the Iranians, backed by the Russians. When the Americans were to leave Syria, they did not even inform us. They dumped Saudi Arabia and all the coalition partners, you know, right there. So we now find the Russians, they ended up finishing the war. So the end product of it is that you now have Iranians or the Shiites looking more closely to say, hang on a minute, what is the business of Nigeria, you know, in this Sunni-led coalition
Especially
of the willing?
when we're not necessarily an Islamic country, we're secular.
We are not. We're supposed to be a secular country. When you look at the country as it is today, nobody even remembers the traditional religion worshippers. Go and Google it, please. I want you to go and check. The majority of people in the whole world are not Muslims and Christians. Combine them together, they're just about 48.98% of the world population. The vast majority of people are not even Christians or Muslim. So therefore, the vast majority of the people are even excluded. When you talk about governance in Nigeria, people only talk about Muslim and Christians being reflected in government. Nobody remembers that you have billions of Nigerians, you know, who are traditional religion believers, and nobody reckons with them.
Going forward, if you were to be one of those who were to advise the presidency or the federal government on the way forward on this issue, being that, like we said, this might just be the start of something really, really bad for us as a country, being that we've dabbled into stuff that we shouldn't be dabbling into. What would your advice be to Mr. President as to handling this issue?
I would strongly advise Mr. President to go into dialogue. The issue of proscription, they should forget it. They should deproscribe, because they will end up having to talk, you know, to those people. It's just like saying you are proscribing Boko Haram. It's an idea. You cannot proscribe an idea. The people are there. The Shiites are in millions in Nigeria. So how do you deal with that? Because you only end up driving them on the ground in a way that they might emerge as a threat, a credible threat to the country. Mr. President needs to understand that we don't want this country to be balkanized into different groups, in different countries. If you look at what is going on today, Northwest is really totally devastated by Boko Haram warfare. Now you have the X-Men, you know, devastating the middle belt. So do you want to open another front in Northwest, which is based on, you know, the home base of El-Zakzaky? So these are really worrying times for all of us, and it calls for sober reflection. And one can only hope Mr. President will not listen to the hawks, but listen to people who are genuinely interested in negotiation. We can resolve, even all wars worldwide ended up, you know, on the negotiation table.
Thank you very much, Biodun Sowunmi, Public Affairs Analyst, for speaking with us. We appreciate it.